and move straight on to the content for today, which is the collaboration cycle, and look at what that's got to offer us after we've had a look at the awakening cycle yesterday. Now, just to begin, I'm going to just give a summary of the awakening cycle that we discussed yesterday. And the awakening cycle is really a kind of map of how awake people actually are in terms of their consciousness, how aware they are, how tuned in they are to the reality around them. And I said that the person who has the minimum understanding or awareness or ability to tune into their reality is what I would call in a state of sedation. They're sedated, a bit like someone in hospital who's on drips and tubes and drugs and various devices, and they usually are put into sedation because it's to help them avoid experiencing trauma or suffering. And you usually find that in life, people who are sedated, they're very similar to that vision you might have of someone who's in hospital tied up to those tubes and devices and drugs. They literally are people who are attached to various devices. They're attached to their TV, they are attached to their computer, they're attached to their smartphone, they're attached to their magazines. Now, don't get me wrong, each of these devices, each of these distractions, if you will, do serve a purpose in terms of informing people and keeping them connected. However, if it's something that people are depending on to the degree where they're excluding having a direct experience with the world and face-to-face conversations with people, then it's something ultimately that's going to not allow people to wake up to what's really going on around them. If their heads are buried deep in electronic devices or things that remove them from real-world experience, then of course they are not going to be able to fully awake to the actual reality that's going on around them. Now, when you take someone off their devices, you remove someone from their smartphone, the TV, the newspapers, even books, then you end up in a space where a person has nothing to interact with other than themselves, the people around them, and in what things there are in nature. Now, if someone enters into that state, then at least, unlike someone who's sedated, just like in hospital, you can shake them up as much as you like, but they're not really going to wake up. The difference between that kind of person and someone who's been taken off all those devices and drugs is that person, instead of being sedated, they will be at least just sleeping. And someone who's asleep, you can wake them up by just shoving them or pushing them. And it's also possible when they've had enough rest that they'll actually wake up of their own volition and of their own accord. And this often happens when people return to nature, return to their own personal space and remove themselves from all the artificial things that have been created by mankind. They will quite naturally recuperate and wake up to what's really going on around them. Now, once that starts to happen, they will start to go through the motions of really connecting into reality and working with it as it is. Now, they might not know what they're doing, and it might mean that they'll behave a bit like a sleepwalker. Someone who, from a distance, looks like they're awake, they're up and around, they're walking, but when you get close to them, they're kind of in their own little world. They've got some little loop going on inside their heads, and they're preoccupied with something, and they're not going to come out of that until that loop inside is complete. That need or obsession that they've got is something that's being attended to. Now, after that, it's possible that they will wake up, or they might even go back to sleep. If they do wake up, then it might not happen fully and instantly. It might happen in little short bursts. And this short bursts of awakening between sleepwalking and actually being fully awakened is what's called sleep waking. And this is where someone gets a glimpse of what things really are like, the truth behind their life, their situation, the world. But then they kind of drift back into a lower level of awareness, going through the motions, and they've got a memory of the truth, but they can't really act on it effectively. Now, it does happen that if that glimpse that they get is long enough and sustained enough, then they will enter into a full state of awakening. Just like someone who wakes up from their bed, initially they might be awake, but they might not be actually out of their bed. So it's possible that they might drift back to sleep, even though they've seen things in a fully awakened state. So that process is called sleep waking. Now, if they do wake up fully, it doesn't mean they're out of bed. It just means they're alert and they're awake and they can see what's going on around them. And that state is called awakening. People who are awakened are the only people who can actually see other people who are awake. They can also see other people who are asleep. They can see other people who are sedated. They can see people who are sleepwalking. All the other people, the people who are sedated, asleep or sleepwalking, sleepwaking, probably not sleepwaking, but all those other people, they cannot see each other. Two people who are asleep cannot see each other. Two people who are sedated, they can't see each other or acknowledge each other or appreciate each other. So it's only people who are awake that can actually see each other and acknowledge each other and have true dialogue and truly be able to ultimately collaborate with one another to make a difference for each other and beyond themselves. So people who are awake are a very unique breed of individuals. But even people who are awake aren't necessarily doing anything with what they see and what they observe and what they know. It's like someone being in bed but not actually getting up and moving around their house or feeding themselves. They rely on other people to come and help them. It's almost like they're kind of bedridden in terms of their consciousness. So the next stage is where someone doesn't just wake up, but they can act on what they see. They can act and follow through on their own intentions. They can go and feed themselves and nurture themselves, look after themselves. If they want to get a different view of the world rather than just what they see from their bed and the window that they have access to, they have the ability to get up out of that bed and move around the house and possibly even go outside and look at things from a completely different perspective. And what we're talking about here, when I say house, I'm metaphorically really talking about a person's experience, their consciousness, their lifestyle, the sum of all of their knowledge and awareness that they've accumulated over their entire life. That's the space within which they are being aware. That's the space within which they make all their decisions and how they actually gravitate towards things. Now, once someone's active, of course, if there's other people who are also active and awake, then that person who's active can go and start doing things with them. They could even go to someone who's just woken up and actually guide them and help them and show them how to become active themselves. But more importantly, active people can at least look after themselves, and they can liaise with others to ensure that the people who are awake or sleeping or sedated are all properly looked after. Now, there comes a point when you get your own house in order, so to speak, then it's time for you to go out into the street and into the community and see if you can do something beyond just looking after yourself. Now, in your community, there might be people who are also going to be awakened, and they are going to look for others that they can connect up with where they can help each other out. This process of going out into the world with your consciousness that's now been awakened and activated is what I call affiliation. And affiliation is literally going out and making connections with others in your community. And these people in your community might be in your family, they might be at work, or they might be physically in your neighborhood, or they might be a virtual community online, for example. But they tend to have the same kind of consciousness as you, and they're awake to the same sort of things as you. You can do things with them because they're awake. You certainly wouldn't consider people to be part of your community if they were asleep or they were sedated, because they couldn't get up and do anything within that community. There'll be someone that would need to be looked after by that community. So the active members of your community, the ones that are consciously seeking affiliation as well, they're the ones that are going to make up ultimately your tribe, the people that you're going to grow with on a daily basis. Now, affiliation at that point, it is something that is very much seeded based on the connection that you make with people. How do you actually link up with them? How do you actually engage with them? Do you do things which empower each other? Do you do things where you have fun with one another? And the kind of connection that you make with people depends on those kinds of things. It depends on how much you're interested in doing something that's serious, how much you're interested in doing something that's just fun, something you want to like. And sometimes it's simply just about doing something that's engaging, regardless of whether it's entertaining or empowering or educational. So those three factors of engagement, entertainment and empowerment, they usually need to be in the right proportions for you to end up affiliating with someone. And there's a likelihood that if you get it right, then you'll really resonate with them and you may want to go on and do things with those individuals. Okay, so that stage of affiliation, as said, consists of those three factors that I mentioned: engagement, empowerment, and also entertainment. Now, they've got to be in the right proportions in order for you to link up with somebody else. If you link up with somebody else and that person's more interested in having fun and entertainment rather than doing something around learning or empowerment, then the two of you are probably not going to end up affiliating with one another or connecting with one another, unless you just happen to find each other very engaging, in which case 2 out of 3 is something that usually leads to an affiliation or a connection. Sometimes people decide that they like things the way they are and they don't want to change them, and it's possible that two people might not end up making a connection. And in some situations it's important that they do make a connection because the community might depend on it, for example, or other people are going to need help as a consequence of those two people actually affiliating and connecting with each other. Now, in situations where people have got differences of opinion between how much fun they want to have and how much they want to learn and how much they want to engage with each other, there can be conflict that can actually arise. Now, if it's between awakened people, then it's usually healthy conflict. But even healthy conflict needs to be mediated in some kind of way. In my experience, one of the best ways to mediate healthy conflict is to use a form of communication called nonviolent communication, which is something I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment. So nonviolent communication is a great mediator, it's a great leveler in terms of differences between people, such that those two people can have a stronger connection, a stronger affiliation with one another. So providing the proportions are right and kind of match between two people, there's a likelihood that the two people are really going to get a buzz from each other. They're actually going to find that the overall energy that results as a result of the fun that they're having, what they're learning from each other and how engaging they are being with one another, that overall resonance, which is kind of indicated here by the orange circle that surrounds everything, that resonance, that vibe, is going to be something that will emerge as a result of both of those people kind of having a shared interest in what they're actually learning with each other, or what they're learning by themselves even, how they're actually learning, and they've made a choice also about who they actually want to learn with. They certainly won't be linking up with somebody else, for example, if they want to learn on their own independently of other people. The only person who they want to learn with was themselves. On the other hand, if they know that they've got weaknesses in what they're trying to do in their life and their needs and their skills and their knowledge, they know then that they might have to go to other people to learn with them, and maybe they can exchange things where they can both learn from each other. So sometimes resonance is also about knowing whether you should be learning by yourself or whether you should be learning together with other people. In that sort of situation, you will find that the fun bit and the learning bit, the empowerment bit, they are in harmony. They're in a kind of sacred geometry with each other. And when what you like and what you're learning together with other people are in harmony, then you'll tend to kind of have a good vibe between you. There'll be a rapport. There will literally be a resonance. You'll be on the similar kind of complementary kind of frequency. So if you put all those things together, it's possible that if you do find someone that shares what you learn and how you learn and who you learn with and the way you like things and what you like and how you're learning and what you're learning are in harmony between you, then it's also possible that you're going to discover why you're actually learning things the way you are. You actually discover something that is your purpose. So it's important that if you do communicate with one another, that you do your best to ensure that you're always honouring one another. And if you do honour one another, then probably one of the best ways to do that in terms of communicating with other people is to do communication which is honouring in terms of the way that it's done. And that means that there isn't any aggression necessarily or any violence, even in literal or word form. It's important that in that situation you use something called nonviolent communication, which was originally created by Marshall Rosenberg in his book Nonviolent Communication. Nonviolent communication asks that people clearly express themselves or articulate themselves. Clearly, if two people don't know how to say what's on their minds, then it's possible that that could be a factor that leads to them not really connecting up with each other or having some kind of resonance or rapport between themselves. It's also important that the two individuals are not being judgmental. They are exploring, they are looking at what's there, and they're not making a person right or wrong because of what they do, who they are, or the way that they are actually connecting. It's also important that if one person is looking for something from the other person, that they go about doing it through a clear request rather than through implied a request. So if you want to have someone go out with you to the cinema, rather than just saying, shall we go out, it would be better in that situation to say, shall we go out to the cinema? So being specific in your request and articulating that request in a way which is not something that has any judgment associated with it. If, for example, someone says no, they're not to be made to feel bad for that, and you're not to feel bad for them saying no to you. It's really important that these three factors are balanced in terms of how they work together in nonviolent communication. It's also important that if you're feeling something about a particular situation, that you do share your feelings, you share your emotions, but you do it in a way where the emotions are useful in getting your request met, and also they help you effectively express yourself as well. So the term here I use is effective emotion. The emotion is actually serving a purpose rather than being just some random thing or something that undermines what it is that you're trying to do with one another. Now, ultimately, it's about expressing what you need rather than pointing out undesirables about someone. So rather than saying, I don't like you because you do these things, and then getting the person's back up as a consequence of that, it would be better to say, I would like it if you would do this, or you would behave this way, or you could do this for me. So don't focus on what you don't want, always focus on what you do want, but if you can, try and focus also much more on what you need that will empower you, as opposed to just something that you like that's going to make you feel good. It's got to be ultimately focused about growth and happiness rather than just mere stimulation or entertainment. I would also suggest that you focus on addressing priorities between yourself and other people before your preferences. So look at what you can ultimately learn from one another and what you can do for the long term rather than just what you can enjoy for the short term. Also, focus on intentions rather than interests. People's interests can change on a day-by-day basis, but their intentions, deeper down within them, they tend to be a little bit longer lasting. And if you can fathom out what someone's intentions are behind their interests, then you're much more likely to build a connection which is sustainable. Lastly, behaviours someone has on a given day can obviously change. They might be angry one day and the next day they might not be. Underneath that ephemeral behaviour is the person's true character, their authentic way of being. And it's important that when you're connecting with people that you always seek to connect with that rather than the behaviour that just happens to be showing up on that day and that's ephemeral. You want to work with things that are longer lasting rather than things that are just short term. You can't ignore the things that are in the short term. You certainly need to look at what's bringing them up. And you usually find the behaviours a person has on a given day are linked to the factors that have just been mentioned. They are factors to do with the way the person's expressing themselves. It's to do with some aspect of judgment or a request that they're trying to make or a feeling that they're trying to express. And they might also be pointing out things that are upsetting them, that are undesirables, but they just don't know what it is exactly that they would actually want to desire, a genuine need that they want to address in terms of a priority. And they might have difficulties in even knowing what their real intentions are or who they are in terms of their authentic way of being. So do take into account all of these factors when you're communicating with people, because they're critical in order for you to make the right kind of connection with someone and build the right kind of frequency to communicate on between you. Okay, now if we take what we've just learned about engagement, empowerment and entertainment and how nonviolent communication adjusts those proportions so that the two people that are connecting up are going to be in a state of resonance, they're going to be on the same vibe, on an empowering frequency, a serving frequency, then you can take that resonance that's been created and use it as a seed for what is the first step of the collaboration cycle, which is connection. Now, at this point, what I'm going to do is just pause, and I'm going to just get some feedback from some of the members of the audience before we actually go into the collaboration cycle proper, and just ask what's been made so far of the seeds, if you like, that are needing to be planted before you even begin to collaborate with somebody else by making that first connection with them. I should also add that all of this equally applies not just between two people, but also for a person trying to collaborate with themselves, trying to get on with themselves, or trying to get the different parts of their life to fit together. It applies in the sense that the person needs to get their life in proportion in terms of things that they want to learn, things that they want to like and have fun with, and things that are going to keep them from being bored and stay engaged in what they're actually doing. They're going to need to make clear requests for themselves. They need to articulate things for themselves and address their own priorities and be clear about their own intentions. So the collaboration cycle is something that doesn't just apply to people and communities, it also applies to individuals. Collaboration is very much like compassion and charity. People say charity begins at home. Well, compassion and collaboration also begin at home. You've got to learn, first of all, how to collaborate with yourself. You've got to get those things in proportion that help you engage with life and connect with it, and also have a strong connection with yourself before you can ultimately go out and possibly connect with other people and collaborate with them. So collaboration, just like charity, it's something that begins at home. So everything you're learning today, you might want to consider how you might want to use this in your own life for yourself, for you to collaborate with yourself and look after honouring yourself and nurturing yourself so that you can grow in a way which you're enjoying, that's empowering and that's engaging, and ultimately is leading you to learn what you need to fulfill any emerging purpose that's coming up in your life. So bear that in mind, that you can use this for yourself as well as together with other people. Now, as I said, at this point what I'm going to do is just pause the presentation and just go back to some of the people in the audience and ask them what they've heard so far that might be ringing some bells for them or might make them feel that there's something there that they know that they just got to start getting sorted for themselves. Let's start with Hazel. Go ahead, Hazel.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, it was very interesting. Thank you very much. And it made sense in terms of almost like having a platform or a way or a checklist even, and particularly when it comes to maybe more stressful or challenging situations, and although maybe not likely to necessarily literally check a list, but it was really helpful to sort of think, okay, so what are my intentions? Is this clear? Am I able to communicate in this way? What am I trying to do with the other person? So where possible, I think it's a really sort of helpful model for that. Particularly the last part about addressing the priorities before preference and the intentions before interests, and the way of being before behaviour. I thought that was lovely, really, really good. So it will definitely make me think. I had a very fairly stressful conversation to deal with this afternoon, and I shall definitely think about how I handled it and maybe what I could do next time that would be different. So yeah.
Thank you, Hazel. What's interesting about this is what I presented so far is the seed for collaboration. It's what feeds into the first part of the collaboration cycle, which is connection. But if you can get this sorted, then actually everything else is simply a formality. Because if you have strong resonance with someone and you're both committed to, learn about things and like things and be engaged with things in a very kind of similar kind of way, and you're doing it in a non-violent kind of fashion when it comes to mediating differences, then there's a lot of hope that you'll not just end up having a strong connection, but that strong connection is going to be able to carry you forwards into you both being able to contribute to each other and make a difference to each other, as well as possibly even make a difference beyond yourselves.
Kind of depersonalizes things too, to some degree, I think.
Yeah, it stops making everything so personal and gets you to see there is something that you can access, and if there are difficulties or the challenges that are creating conflict, there are opportunities for you to grow, as opposed to things that are picking you out and singling you out as someone that should be negatively affected by the circumstances. So
what's mine, what's theirs, and it's not so personal, and maybe it's like you were saying, maybe it's what's going on for them, and it's not all, it's not always, it is about you, but it isn't about you.
Yeah, there's a common space, is what I call a third space between you, and you realise ultimately that what you're trying to address is not what's going on for you or even what's going on for the other person. What you're trying to address is what's going on in that space in between, that third space. And it's about honouring that, honouring the relationship. And if you do it right, then that relationship can honour you, and it can also honour the other person. Yeah. All right, thanks very much, Hazel. Let's speak to just two more people. Marsha, are you available to chat? No? Okay. Let's try Denise. Can you hear us, Denise?
Oh, hi.
Well, maybe not for now. Let's speak for one other person then in that case. And then we'll go back to the presentation. And let's speak with Marinella. Go ahead, Marinella. No,
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Marinella.
I think the only thing I can think about is that that I'd always thought about all this in relation to other people, but not about myself. So I realized that, like I said in the beginning of the webinar, that I make myself wrong about things that I should be doing or how I should. So if the collaboration cycle, I could start applying it to myself with myself. So that's great.
It's probably been the most useful for me personally in that regard. I've certainly used it to conduct my relationships and their growth with other people, but I think I've probably got the most out of it as a result of applying it to my own life and getting things in proportion and getting into a state of resonance, if you like, on the right vibe with myself in a way which I've got a rapport with and I can actually get along with, and also allow myself to get things that I like, but also in the process for me to learn things as well. So it's a great thing to apply to yourself as an individual, because if you can practice, and that's the great thing about it, you can practice on this with yourself. And when you get it sufficiently right for yourself, then you'll find naturally that you'll extend it out to others, and you'll start changing the resonance that you have with other people, the vibe and the relationships that you have with other people. Have you noticed that when you do get something sorted for yourself, that when you apply that new shift to your relationships, that the energy changes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have.
Mm-hmm. And can you give us an example of something like that that's happened for you recently?
When I really, it's almost like creating a space of nothing, because usually what happens is because I judge myself so much, then I end up judging other people so much. So when I'm in the space of nothingness, then people can occur in my space without any prejudgments. It's almost like, the space of nothingness kind of grants them being for me.
That's a really valuable thing to do, and I've got to admit that that's been one of the most useful things that I've actually encountered. That when you do create that space for yourself, and you start to get it to be able to nurture you and help you, then there does come a time where that space is something that you open up a little bit to other people, and they find that when they come into your space that they can get the same benefit that you got from it. Is that kind of what happened with you?
Yeah, exactly. It's like when you're saying when somebody, for example, if I experienced talking to somebody who I would term in the category asleep,
mm-hmm.
and I think because they were talking to it, probably sleep waking, somebody
mm-hmm.
who was not asleep but wants to wake, see glimpses of, and I felt that I was being pulled towards getting that person awake, and
mm-hmm.
when I could just be in that space of nothingness, I experienced something like this person was literally listening to me with such attention.
Mm-hmm.
And if I, in a similar situation, decided maybe, let them sleep.
mm-hmm.
I don't think they're strong enough to be awake. I don't think they can wake up.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm not even going to go there.
Mm, yeah. Well, what you did was an act of compassion. And like I've said about collaboration, it's like charity and compassion. It begins at home. And clearly, you wouldn't have been able to do that unless, first of all, you were able to be in a state of compassion towards yourself. And if you're in a state of compassion towards yourself and you eventually get all the compassion you need for yourself, then any new compassion that develops in you is something that you don't need personally because you're full already of compassion. So what happens is it naturally overflows to other people, and that's what happened in that circumstance.
Mm. Yeah, okay. and it's really amazing. It's just also the fact that if I started to be in that situation where it can flow to other people, because sometimes I think I have to plan in my head how I wake. They have to be by a certain point, and that stops me or makes me control the situation. But if I just stand in the space of contribution, then it's different.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something we'll have a look at that more in a moment, where we look at what happens when people move from one stage in collaboration cycle to another, and how important things like a mutual support or even mutual challenge or reflection or processing or compassion are important fuels to help people move along the actual cycle. So thanks very much for that, Marinella. We're going to move on to one more person before we continue. I'm going to have a chat with Shanaz, I think. Can you hear us, Shanaz?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Hey, wow. I'm recognising I'm just in that space of absorbing it all. Mm-hmm. And I just get it all. I just get it all, and I'm someone who has always, since a child, connected with people very strongly, and collaboration's always been my approach, and that's my passion. That's the difference that I want to bring out into the world. So I'm interested in finding out more about the vibe between collaboration and competition, because competition doesn't sort of resonate with me very strongly. So I want to learn more about how the two meet, and where transformation can happen in that there's an understanding between the two.
Well, that's something we'll look at in a moment once I do an overview of the collaboration cycle. But it's important to look at competition from a point of view of compassion. The way I look at the universe is that everything that is in the universe has a purpose. You know, whether it's your ego, whether it's competition, or whether it's even evil people in the world, you know, they have a purpose. They're serving some kind of function. Otherwise, the universe wouldn't have created them and put them there. You know, so I look at competition, and I've been in business for long enough, and also done a lot of work within businesses to know how important it is for a business to be competitive with other businesses in the market. But it should never be done at the expense of collaboration, especially possibilities of partnerships, you know, or alliances between themselves and other businesses, or alliances or collaboration between themselves and customers, for example, and even between suppliers.
Yeah.
So that's something we'll briefly go into when we've had an overview of the collaboration cycle. But it's only recently that I myself have begun to realize that competition does have a place. When you look at the competition, from a compassionate point of view, then you realize actually it's critical in every stage of the collaboration cycle. It's a loop, if you like, a little cycle within the cycle of collaboration. But what you don't want with competition is to be locked up in that loop in one particular stage. Otherwise, you never go forwards with the collaboration. But it's always necessary to refine what's going on with the energy in a particular stage of collaboration. So in that sense, it's really important. But like I said, we'll talk more about that in a moment.
Great.
Okay.
Looking forward to that.
Thanks very much, Shanaz. What we'll do now is continue looking at the collaboration cycle. And as I said, the orange kind of circle here represents the sum effect of two people getting the right kind of engagement between one another using nonviolent communication. And that's led to them wanting to link up based on the right proportion of having fun, doing things that they like, but also doing things that are serious and that are empowering and centered on growth. So when the proportions of each of these things are mediated in the right way by nonviolent communication, the result is, the net effect is resonance. You get two people operating on a vibe which is mutually nurturing for them. And that vibe, that connection, that frequency is the basis for the first step of the collaboration cycle, which is connection. Two people are not going to collaborate with one another unless they've got the right kind of connection, or a strong enough connection. And that connection is rooted in resonance. It's rooted in both those people coming together because they're both interested in the same things in the same proportions, and they've got a language which enables them to mediate and overcome or appreciate one another's differences. Now, if none of that's in place, that connection is never going to happen. You probably find that the two people will not go on and have conversations where they can look at how they might be able to cooperate or contribute to each other. If it isn't right here at this stage, if these proportions aren't right, if the language isn't right, if the rapport or the resonance or the frequency isn't right, people get a feeling about that. They get an instinct, they get a vibe, and often the person they might be talking to might have a huge reputation, they might be incredibly skilled, might even be very likable, but it might be that the overall mix, the overall resonance is one where it just doesn't sit right, and as a consequence the two people are civil with each other, but then they move on and they want to focus on someone else who they have a stronger chemistry with. So connection is really important, and it begins with all the factors I've mentioned. But I've found in my experience that it tends to boil down to one thing. It boils down to the proportion of things that people like and the proportion of things that they're trying to learn. If those two things, what they like and what they're looking to learn, are enough of a match between two people, then they'll tend to connect and build on that particular connection. Once the connection has been formed, then you'll find that the inevitable thing that will follow is conversation. People will start to have a conversation with one another, and the conversation will probably be around the things that they like, around the things that they're trying to learn, or the things that they're finding engaging between themselves. It'll focus perhaps on their priorities. It will focus on their intentions, on their way of being. This is an awakening form of collaboration rather than other kinds of connection where people might, for instance, come together solely because of their preferences, solely because of their behaviors, or solely because of their interests. That's not really collaboration. That's much more of a social thing as opposed to collaboration. So you can get a mix of social interactions as well as interactions which lead to collaboration, but I'm not looking at the social connections today. I'm just looking at collaboration. If you really look at the connection between social and collaborative forms of connecting, you'll find that social connections are really a subset of collaboration interactions. So it's something that I'll probably reserve to actually do a webinar on as a completely separate subject, the whole aspect of resonance and its importance in social interactions. But today we're going to focus on resonance and learning and how that applies specifically to collaboration and building the connections at the beginning of the collaboration cycle. I said if the connection's the right kind of connection and everything's in the right proportions and it's strong enough and the language between the two people is one which allows them to negotiate and mediate, so they both come to a place of agreement rather than too much separation in terms of their opinions and views, then it's possible that they'll want to actually talk with each other a bit more. They'll have more conversations with each other. Now, it might turn out in those conversations that they discover that they don't really have as much in common as they thought, in which case what will happen is they'll go backwards in the cycle and go back to the connection stage, and they may look again at the various intentions that they have and the priorities and the various proportions of things that they're interested in focusing on, and they may decide that they're quite happy to change those things using nonviolent communication. And if that's the case, then that connection will be strong enough to go back to those individuals having more conversations with each other. Now, as I said, this can also be applied to individuals. So if you find that you have a conversation with yourself about something and you've come to a place where you're not happy, then very simply you need to go back to the connection that you have with yourself and look at that and see what proportions of things you have that you're choosing to be connected to, and are you speaking to yourself in the right way without judgment in order for you to end up having a more extended conversation with yourself that will lead you to being able to cooperate and collaborate with yourself and bring a difference to your life. So, like I said, the same principle applies not just between two people or more people, but also perhaps in terms of the connection that you have with yourself and the conversations that you have with yourself that help you increase your ability to collaborate with yourself. Now, after you've had enough conversations with someone, there inevitably comes a time where you have got a bit more trust in them and you feel that you can actually cooperate with them and do something together with them. At the individual level, you might find that there's different parts of your life come to a place of development where they can work with each other. They're not at odds with each other. For example, your home life might not be at odds with your work life, or your food that you're eating is not at odds with the exercise that you're doing if you're looking to improve your health, for example. So you'll find that when the right kind of conversations have taken place, and there's been enough conversations over the right kind of time and in the right spaces as well, then you'll find two people will naturally feel like they want to do something with each other. They want to cooperate and do something together. Sometimes the scene that you're actually in may prevent you from having a decent conversation. You certainly don't want to have a business conversation in a nightclub unless you're doing a shady deal or something like that. You want to be able to go somewhere where you can hear another person and you don't misinterpret what they're saying, and you want to be able to do it in a way where it's actually rewarding for you to have that conversation with them. It's going to lead to cooperation with much greater probability than it would if you're in an environment which is undermining the conversation and your ability to develop it to actual state of cooperation. Okay, if you haven't had enough cooperation between two people, or people decide that they don't want to cooperate with each other, then you find yourself stuck at that stage. Then it's very simple why. You're stuck at that stage because you haven't had enough conversations, or you have not had the right kind of conversations. It might actually be something even deeper. You might find when it comes to cooperation that there's something that you still feel isn't in proportion, that you may have overlooked earlier on because at the time it wasn't so important. But now that you've gone beyond conversation and you're looking actually to do something with someone, something that might have been trivial before might now become more important. So you might need to go back to your connection and check the proportions of things and mediate changes or adaptations so that the two of you are ready to actually cooperate with yourselves. As I said, at the individual level, this is also true. If you find that you've had a conversation with yourself about something, but you just can't get two parts of your life to work together, then again, it means that you either need to meditate and contemplate and reflect a bit more, or it might mean that what you're meditating around, what you're reflecting on, what you're actually connected to at a deeper level, it still isn't right. And that's the reason why you're having difficulty getting different parts of your life to actually work together with one another in a collaborative way. So at an individual level, sometimes you do need to go back right down to the source of your passions, the source of your interests and your intentions, the source of your priorities and your preferences, the source of your behaviors and what's behind all that in terms of your way of being, and see if there's something that's not quite right or proportionate. It's out of alignment in some kind of way. If that is, then once you adjust that in a non-judgmental way using nonviolent communication, then you'll probably find that you'll have a stronger connection with yourself. The conversations that you're having with yourself, things that you're reflecting on and meditating on and contemplating on, you seem to be able to move through them more effectively with less resistance and less obstacles, in which case you will arrive at a place where you can get different parts of your life to fit together much more easily because there's less resistance, there's less inertia. And as a consequence, you feel for the first time that you're literally getting on with yourself. You know, you're actually honoring things that are important to you, and that you're almost hearing voices within yourself that previously you discounted or you just suppressed because either you didn't want to face up to them or there was nothing you could do to actually respond to them. So when those conversations are actually properly resourced, then you can step into a state of cooperation with yourself. Often people have difficulty in cooperating with themselves because the conversations with themselves lead to solutions for which they have no resources, or the solutions might just not be comfortable or easy to actually engage with. So in such situations, you have to ask, what do I want to focus on? Do I want to focus on what I like, my preferences, or am I prepared to put the time and energy into this so that my priorities can be addressed, so I can actually learn something, I can actually grow? And by default, a lot of people will choose the easy route. They'll choose what they like rather than what they need to learn. They'll choose their preferences rather than their priorities. And they'll tend to fall into old behaviors and habits rather than the real way of being that they're trying to get to be expressed. Anybody who does that more frequently than the addressing of priorities and the addressing of intentions and addressing of way of being, they're actually following a way of behaving, a way of being, which has an addictive quality to it. Think about it. If you're focusing on your preferences, what you like, rather than what you need as a priority, if you're focusing on something you want rather than something that you genuinely need that empowers you, in the long term, you're going to be highly stimulated, but you are not going to be supported at all in your life. Ideally, what you want is for it to be the other way around. You want to be fully supported, and then with anything that you have left over, you can devote that to having fun and being stimulated. In reality, that's not how it works. You tend to need to work with both at the same time. You need to grow and support yourself while at the same time doing things that are rewarding for you in a social fashion or an entertainment or a stimulation fashion, just so that you have the wherewithal to keep going with your evolution. So cooperation is naturally followed by contribution. If two people can cooperate with each other, then they can contribute to each other. Contribution could be in terms of time, it could be in terms of money, it could be in terms of resources, or it could be in terms of just exchanging knowledge or wisdom, for example. So there's lots of ways in which contributions can be made between people. But if two people are reluctant to contribute something tangible to each other, then of course it's down to the fact that they are not really effective yet in their ability to cooperate with each other, which is the previous stage. So if it comes to a point where you're asking someone to make a contribution and they're not doing it, or someone's asking you and you don't feel like doing it, then clearly you need to go back and look at how you're cooperating with each other. Maybe you need some conversations around things that you've not yet taken into account, and that's the reason why you're not contributing to each other. You may have gathered that as we move from each of these stages to the next stage, one of the things that is emerging, quite naturally emerges, is trust. At the beginning, you're unlikely to have any established trust between you and another person, or even between you and yourself. But as the stages progress, then obviously trust begins to build and risk ends up being reduced. And you also find that the things that you do tend to move from being short-term things to being long-term things. So when you're going around this part of the cycle, you might go backwards and forwards. You might just be happy just to have conversations and not go on to cooperate and contribute with somebody else. And that usually is indicative of people who are interested in transactional kind of relationships, which are not long-term and just involve planning something on the day rather than well in advance. And that's okay if that's what you're interested in. However, as you naturally go around this cycle, you do eventually start thinking about the long term. You do really look at what it is that you can trust. You do look at what it is that you can do that reduces the risk of you going forwards. So the next stage is really, really critical, which is commitment. If you've got a strong enough connection, you've had enough of the right kind of conversations, you're really good at cooperating with each other, and you feel you've both made the right kind of contributions to each other in the right kind of proportions, then there will naturally come a time where you feel that maybe you want to sustain this rather than do all this on a short-term transactional basis. If that's the case, you might end up making a commitment with one another. Now, this could be a paper contract, if you're in business, for example, or it might just be a gentleman's agreement between two people. It might be just a promise. There's a whole number of ways in which you can obviously make a commitment with somebody, but usually this point in the collaboration cycle marks a significant shift in how you're actually relating with people. And the significant shift is a move from doing things in a transactional way, doing things in a short-term fashion, doing things which it doesn't matter if your trust gets abused, you're not going to lose much because there's not much that's been committed. And it all moves from that side of the fence to the other side of the fence. Instead of looking at things short-term, you're looking at things for the long-term. You actually start to make plans ahead of time, maybe weeks in advance or months in advance or years in advance. Also, you find at this point you've contributed enough to each other that you feel you can really trust each other. And so risk for you is something that appears to be reduced at this particular point. The exact details of how you move from one stage to the next and what factors are really important to look out for, or that, you know, if they're not right, you need to be perhaps revisiting an earlier stage. We'll have a look at in a moment. But for now, let's just carry on around the cycle, and then once we finish the cycle, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on what goes on between the stages and why sometimes it's necessary to go in reverse in the collaboration cycle and actually start engaging in a competitive interaction with somebody. That's effectively what the collaboration cycle is in reverse. It's the competition cycle. If you think about what we've done so far, you know, if people are in competition, they won't necessarily want to commit to each other. The contribution will be focused on themselves rather than with other people. They'll tend to want other people to cooperate with them in their favor rather than the other person's favor. And conversations are going to be centered on your interests rather than somebody else's. And you want other people to connect to you rather than you have to connect to them. So if you were going around that way, then you are increasing the focus on yourself and you're reducing the benefit that other people are actually getting. And that is, of course, typical for someone who's in a state of competition with other people. Now, what can be interesting is when you apply this to an individual and themselves. A person who's in competition with themselves, that can lead to interesting consequences. But we'll have a look at that in a moment. What does it mean to actually reverse in the collaboration cycle? What are the effects and what sort of things allow that to happen? And when is it actually useful to reverse and focus on your own interests? We'll have a look at that in a moment when we look at what goes on between the stages. Okay, now this first half of the cycle is, like I said, significant in that it just generally tends to focus on cooperation rather than genuine collaboration, which is a more long-term thing. So the right-hand side of the cycle, the first half of the cycle, is something we'll talk about in a moment. It's the cooperative part of the cycle. And the left-hand side is what's known as the collaborative part of the cycle. We'll look a little bit more about those features, some of which I've already mentioned in a few moments. Now, when you come to the place of commitment, it might not be a single commitment. It might be several commitments that need to be made. You find that each stage really is a collection of things from the previous stages. So commitment really comes about as a result of a number of contributions that have been made between two people. Contributions happen because a number of different things a person has chosen to cooperate around with somebody else. Cooperation tends to happen because a number of different conversations that were had that led to that person want to cooperate with another person. The conversations themselves are things that emerge as a result of a number of connections along different lines of resonance. So each stage really is the sum of a number of things from the previous stage. So commitment in a similar sense then is not necessarily a singular thing. Sometimes if you really want to move over to the collaborative part of the cycle, you don't just make one commitment. You tend to make more than one commitment. And it's a collection of commitments that together lead to people actually going forwards and actually collaborating with each other. So true collaboration isn't really about one commitment. It tends to be about a number of commitments that are joined up, and when they're joined up in a way that has integrity, then it's possible for those individuals to go forwards and genuinely collaborate and work on a project which is way bigger than they would have been able to work on for themselves, and typically is something that's not just going to happen on one day. It's going to happen over a long period of time. There are exceptions. For example, you might work for a lot of months just so that you could carry out an event on one particular day, like a rock concert, for example. You might plan for that months in advance, but on the day it only lasts a few hours. So there are exceptions to that, and it works the other way too. Sometimes you're doing something on one day, but it has consequences for a wide geography. It could happen to have an influence all over the world, for example. So you need to look at it in terms of factors of space, time, and even the population of people, the community of people that you're going to affect. So those three factors are really important in knowing ultimately what you're going to aim your collaboration towards: space and time, and what I would call mindset or consciousness, space, time, and mind. So bear that in mind when you're making your commitments to help focus exactly what kind of end result you're looking for, or what kind of process you're actually looking for that will take you there. Now, after collaboration, when people do choose to collaborate and they've made their commitments to each other, then they've obviously got to carry out those commitments now that they've joined them all up together into a nice box with a string and a bow on it. And once you've actually made those agreements, you can begin the process of taking those commitments and acting on them and creating things that are meant to manifest from those commitments. So creation is often the first thing that is an outcome of collaboration. Something gets created. It's meant to be something bigger than people would have been able to create by themselves, and it's something which typically is not just going to be shared by those people who are creating it. It's something that typically is going to have an effect beyond them. It's going to be communicated out to a wider audience in the world, and as a result of that communication, whether that's done through marketing or face-to-face or other methods, that creation and the communication of it and the sharing of it out in the world leads to other people getting a benefit from it and getting connected in to what it is that's been created, and getting connected in to the consequences of that collaboration. So we find ourselves back at the beginning of the cycle, but what we find here is the connection that we are now beginning to nurture is not between two or more people. It's between those people and a bigger audience. It could be their customers, it could be someone who's a member of a family having a conversation with their family, or their family having a conversation with people in their community. Maybe it's someone who works in a department within a business and they've improved how everybody collaborates with one another within that department, and now they want to improve the department's reputation in the company as a whole, and therefore they have to build stronger relationships and connections with the other departments. So the scale of things at this point goes up, but the same process applies. Now you're having conversations between communities as opposed to individuals. Now you're getting them to cooperate and contribute to one another, maybe in trade examples of collaboration. You get different countries contributing to each other and developing trade agreements and choosing to collaborate with one another on distribution of resources like oil, for example, and maybe even creating agreements which ultimately get communicated out to the world at large so that everybody can be part of that. the internet and the World Wide Web are probably examples of the biggest kinds of collaboration, that have ever been carried out. They started off small, but a number of loops around the collaboration cycle, and a few years later we have the internet, we have Google, we have Facebook, we have the World Wide Web. So all of those kinds of projects, they have just done their number of iterations around the collaboration cycle, and as a consequence they've got to be as influential as they are. And as I've said before, you can equally do this with yourself as an individual, and you don't need to really go around many iterations of the cycle before you end up in a state of very high collaboration with yourself. And the natural consequence of that is that collaboration is like a field, it's like an energy field. Once it's strong inside of you, then it starts to expand and radiate beyond you into your space. And you'll find that people will naturally start to collaborate with you and not play games with you, because there's something about you that they sense, that they realize that they can't afford to be inauthentic with you. They can't afford to play games with you. It's something that comes across in your presence. There's an increased gravitas that you actually have as an individual. And of course, if you extend that out to a partnership, then a business has a gravitas. If you extend that out into your family or your community, then your community has a gravitas to it and a presence, and it gets respected. It's something that people will honor rather than abuse. So collaboration has all sorts of effects, and if you can understand things at the basic level, then the rewards that you can harvest as a consequence of getting collaboration seeded within yourself and amongst your immediate partners and friends and family can actually be really, really huge, and they could even go on and change the world. Now, that is the collaboration cycle. If you get stuck at any stage, simply go back to the previous stage and try and work on that a little bit more. And if, again, things are not being able to be resolved there, then again, you might need to go back to an earlier stage. So you need to keep doing that until you find that you've got enough of what you need in order to move to the next stage. Now, exactly what it is that you need to move on to the next stage, or what you need to look back at if you're finding that you're stuck at a stage and you need to go backwards, we'll have an exploration of that in the next couple of slides. But what I'd like to do is just get some feedback at this point about what you've seen about the collaboration cycle as a whole before we go and look at the actual dynamics of what goes on between the stages and what makes things move forward, and what actually leads on occasions to the need for people to go backwards in the cycle and work in a competitive way as opposed to purely on collaboration. All right, so I'm just going to talk to Hazel again, I think, and just ask what you think of what's been said so far.
Well, it's really interesting, and I feel that from what you're saying, when there's when somebody's coherent and very clear, it does create a certain, I suppose, a quality or tone that they have, like you're saying, and then it gives a statement to the world. And if that is maintained, and the person doesn't fall back into other ways of operating, then the people that they're collaborating with, if they choose not to be that way, it just won't happen. They won't be able to work together. But it's so easy to see often that, and I'm certainly going in as a consultant into places where there's these little infighting things going on, and I can definitely see around this cycle where people get a little bit stuck and they can't quite see the wood for the trees, because like you're saying, they're competing and they don't even realize that they are. And they think they don't have self-interest, for example, but they do, and they don't realize that. So I think this model would be really, really helpful. Certainly I find it really helpful, and I shall make sure I'm observing things, and it'd be really useful to take into businesses and so forth, and to help people understand that, because it's simple too, you know.
When people do compete, there's one belief that I have about human beings is that at a fundamental level, they're just trying to be happy. They're just trying to make themselves happy.
Yeah.
And, if they were happy, then they probably wouldn't do things which are underhand or deceptive or otherwise. So often when you find people are stuck at a particular stage and they are having to go backwards, it's because there's something that they're just not being honoured around, or they feel there's something that is not being nurtured around, and therefore it's necessary to go back and find out what's not being honoured, find out what's not being nurtured, find out what specific individual interest is not being attended to, because you can't really go forwards in collaboration unless individuals feel that they are being nurtured by the process and that they're being honoured by the process. If that's not the case, then they'll start to look after their own interests and do what they can to honour themselves and nurture themselves independently of other people, in which case they start entering into a kind of competitive state with the other person, because they focus more on themselves and honouring themselves than they do the other people. But then that's inevitable. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a sign that you need to come back to the table and have another conversation, or go back to a previous stage and maybe make that a bit more solid. So that's an example of what I mean by competition. But we're going to look a little bit more about that instead in a moment.
Thank you. It's really helpful.
Thanks, Hazel. One more, I think, and then we'll carry on. Shanaz, if you're ready.
Yeah, I am ready. It's the second time you caught me doing something else and listening at the same time. Yeah, what's really I've become really present to is two words really, is relationships and integrity. As you were talking, I was just thinking, oh well, yeah, this is the whole thing about one human being connecting with another, and how we do that, and how we can overcome conflict in a relationship, and conflict between countries and nations, how they talk and connect with each other. And I've just really been reminded of the key for me within all this is integrity, whether you're in the competing aspect or just that single transaction, or just continuing along the whole cycle of collaboration. So yeah, I'm playing around with those two.
Well, the whole reason I created the collaboration cycle was because I observed charitable groups working in communities, and they were doing great jobs, but I found one example where there was a number of charitable groups working on one site, in one building, and they were all doing great work respectively in the community, but they were hardly any of them were talking to each other and cooperating with each other. And I found it really alarming. And I coined a term at the time and said that unfortunately this group of charitable organisations that are all inhabiting the same space are suffering from collaboration illiteracy. They are they're illiterate in collaboration. And I thought about this, and I thought this would be great to teach children in a more simplified form at school, and make it one of the basics, like reading, writing and arithmetic, and collaboration. Learn how to collaborate with yourself, and ultimately expand that out to collaborating with others. There'll be a lot less bullying for a start, I think, in schools if that was a consequence. And there'll certainly be a lot less conflict as well. And one of the things that we'll talk about in a moment is nonviolent communication. Marshall Rosenberg, who created that, he spent a lot of time in conflict resolution between the Palestinians, the Israelis, working for the Americans, the UN. He's done a lot of that work, and ultimately it's about collaboration. So if children could learn that at an early age, then I think a lot of the world's issues would end up starting to disappear.
Wouldn't that be amazing?
So I'm working with a number of educational organisations at the moment who are looking to put programs into schools, and this is one of the things that I'm going to look to see if I can make part of those programs.
Cool.
So it'll be interesting to see what the effects are a few years down the line.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Shanaz. What we'll do now is move on to the next slide. And this is about moving forwards along the collaboration cycle from one step to the next, from connection to conversation, from conversation to cooperation and contribution and so on. And there are what you might call rules for moving effectively forwards in terms of the actual collaboration cycle. Now, to move to the next stage of collaborating, when you're at a particular stage like connection, for example, there's got to be enough of the right factors to encourage two people to move forwards to the next stage, or even encourage a person to feel that different parts of their life can be joined up and actually complement one another and collaborate with one another. So one of the things that's really important is that in the case of two people collaborating with each other, they've got to feel that they're both getting the kind of support that they're looking for in going forwards. They've also got to feel that what they're going to go through is something that they're going to learn from. It's something that's going to stretch them and improve their capacity. It's something that's going to challenge them. And lastly, it's got to be something that is being well thought through. It's got to be something that enough reflection and processing is actually taking place. So when two people are in conversation with each other or they are collaborating, if they both feel they're getting the support they're looking for, they both feel they're stretching and growing as a consequence, and they both feel that everything's been pretty well thought through and processed, then they're probably going to move forwards. Now, each of these things, support, challenge, and reflection, how do you know whether you've had the right kind of support? How do you know whether you've had the right kind of challenge? How do you know whether you've had the right kind of reflection or processing going on? Well, in order for you to trust that you have, then you need to get proof that you've had the right support, and you need to sometimes demonstrate or show proof that you're going to give the support that another person might be looking for. So it works both ways, and when each of these qualities are in proportion and present, then two people will end up having trust between one another. In the case of an individual, a person will end up trusting themselves on a particular part of their life. But as I said, it depends on whether there is proof available to show each of these things is actually present. And there are three kinds of proof. The typical kind of proof most people refer to is evidence. Evidence is something that's tangible, something that's measurable, something you can point at. It's something that two people can see in a physical kind of way. And it's not necessarily something you can know or something you can experience, but at least you can observe it. It's something that's visible in some kind of way. The next kind of proof is experience. Now, if you feel good about going forwards with someone on collaboration, or you feel good about yourself going forwards on something, despite the evidence, despite there being a lack of evidence, then for some people that's enough. They don't really care about the evidence. It's important that they have an experience of the situation in which that they, is something that they can trust. Lastly, some people don't really put too much stock into the experience they're having or even the evidence that's been presented. What matters to them is that it makes sense, that things have some kind of logic to them, or there's some kind of principle behind them, some kind of model, and they're educated enough and informed enough to actually go forwards. So these three kinds of proof, evidence, experience, and education, they need to exist in the right proportions. So you might need evidence of support, you might need to have experienced getting that support, and you might need to have a framework to show how you're going to get support in a way that makes sense and is sensible based on some kind of principle. And equally, you can apply those three forms of proof to challenge and also to processing and reflection. But in a nutshell, if you want to move from one stage to the next, there's got to be some kind of trust. that's been built as a result of you having seen enough evidence, you getting the right kind of experience of what's going on, and also things happening in a way that makes sense to you. Providing you get those three kinds of proof in the support that you're looking for, the challenge that you're seeking, and the things that you feel that you've got to reflect on and process, you will inevitably go forwards in the collaboration cycle. You will move to the next step of connection or conversation or contribution or cooperation. You'll advance. Now, having said that, sometimes you do need to go in reverse in the collaboration cycle, and whenever you take a step in reverse, you are actually taking part in competition in one way or another. All right. Now, if you're going back to a previous stage in the cycle, it's usually needed if there isn't enough of the right support, of the right challenge or stretch, or the right kind of reflection or processing. If you're stuck at a particular stage and you don't feel supported, or you feel what you're about to do is just not going to be worth the dividends, or there's something about it which doesn't fit in your mind, and you feel you've not thought it through enough, then it doesn't make sense to go forwards, because you're going to end up not getting as much benefit as you planned. Therefore, you have to go back. You have to go and seek more support for yourself. You have to go and seek more of a dividend, more of a challenge, more of a stretch, more of an increase in capacity in the previous stage. You might need to go back and think through things more, or have the other person reflect a bit more on your needs. So what you'll find is that reversing in the collaboration cycle is often something that gets experienced as competition. You might look at the other person and think that they're focusing on their own interests, and they end up competing with you about getting resources or getting dividends or benefits, for example. And it's not that they are being selfish, they are just trying to ensure that they're being honoured, that they're being nurtured as a result of going forwards, and they're not going to end up being undermined. So it's important to look at competition as something that's necessary in order to ensure the individuals are going to be nurtured, so that everyone can grow together. That's really what competition needs to be looked at. Now, where people feel they need their own interests looked after more, this is inevitable. They will go back to a previous stage and seek the right support, the challenge or reflection that's actually needed. And it often happens if there's suspicion or there's not enough trust between two people. And this is due to there not being enough of the proofs that are needed to go forwards. There's not enough evidence to go forwards. The experience of what's happening, it just isn't working for someone. It doesn't feel right. Or things just don't make sense anymore. The principles that are being used, the frameworks that are being used, there's something about them which doesn't look right and doesn't look like it makes sense. So what people will do is they'll seek more evidence. They'll want a better experience. They want something that makes more sense. And they want each of those things in the support they're looking for, the increased capacity that they're looking for, and in the things that they've actually got to think through. Now, providing that's actually then made available when someone does go back, then you'll find that two people are willing to end up, working together again and looking at what they can do together rather than just focusing on their individual interests. So competition is a natural part of the collaboration cycle. It can happen at any stage, and it can go through several cycles between two stages. You might need to go back several stages before you can go move forwards. So whenever you move backwards along the collaboration cycle, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You need to look at it as a form of refinement of collaboration rather than an undermining of it. The only exception is when you spend too much time going backwards or locked at a particular stage, and it's happening in a disproportionate way, and there's not enough time being spent going forwards. There's no harm in rushing through the whole collaboration cycle in one go. If you're doing it in a small way, you can do a pilot if you like, a little trial run, and the next time round you can refine it and commit to it a bit more deeply. So every time you work around the collaboration cycle, you are effectively refining your collaboration. But sometimes, instead of having to go through several collaboration cycles, you can do it more effectively by having several competition cycles within the collaboration cycle, where you're going back to previous stages and then going forwards and then maybe going back again, and you keep reiterating that phase of the collaboration cycle until you both feel respected and honoured and nurtured with what you're getting, that you feel you can go forwards and focus on your common interests. So competition really needs to be looked at as a necessary way of refining collaboration, rather than something that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, the collaboration cycle is something that has two parts to it that I mentioned earlier. The first half of it, everything up to the commitment stage, but not including the commitment stage, it's fundamentally about basic cooperation. And it has specific kind of features that kind of describe it, what people do in that part of the cycle. The things that people do tend to be for the short term. They are, be done for one day or a week, but they're not really aimed for the long term. They tend to be done on a random basis. Someone calls up somebody and says, can you do me a favor? Can you do this? And it's not necessarily something that's planned. It's just done, in a spontaneous kind of way. Also, you find that because trust tends to be quite low, and there's no real commitment behind most of the things that are being done, that there's a higher risk to the interactions and the exchanges that people actually have. And that, of course, if there's a higher risk and there's not much of a history of commitment or contribution, for example, then there tends to be low trust as well. And because the exchanges tend to be short-term, they tend to be small and transactional, if trust is actually abused in some kind of way, usually the person doesn't end up losing that much. So although things are high risk, the kind of exchanges that go on between people tend to be small enough not to cause too much of a loss in the event that something does go wrong. Now, the second half of the cycle is something that people step into once they've made a commitment to one another, and that's the collaborative part of the cycle. So if you're just hanging out in the first half of the cycle, all you're doing is cooperating. You aren't really collaborating. Collaboration actually involves commitment, and collaboration is something that you'll tend to be focusing on for the long term. You're not going to call up someone and say, can we do a rock concert today? You're not going to call them up and say, let's build a railway between London and Edinburgh today. It tends to be something that you're going to have to plan ahead for months, years even. It's going to be a long-term project. So planning is very, very critical to monitor each of those stages over that time. It tends to also be lower risk because by the time you got to this stage, everything's kind of been nailed down. You have commitments, there's been enough contributions made, there's plenty of the right kind of cooperation, all the conversations that need to be carried out in order for things to clearly progress over several years or months have been carried out, and there's a strong sense of connection between the partners because the people have been selected and vetted over quite some time or through their history and their reputation. And on top of that, a level of trust in these situations. And it's possible that you can commit to bigger resources being exchanged between people, like more time, more money, more assets, and more personnel, for example, or just more of your own possessions if you're looking at doing this individually with yourself, for example. So the collaboration cycle has these two parts to it, cooperation and collaboration, and that moves on to the collaboration part once commitment is actually made between people. There's no harm in just hanging out in the cooperation stage if people are not willing to make commitments. But if you want to do something for the long term and you want to do something which is going to have a bigger impact in the world, then you're probably going to have to somewhere along the line make a commitment, make a promise, or some kind of agreement to ensure that you can go forwards and trust that things are going to be able to be sustained for the long term. Okay, that's it. Thanks everybody for listening in today. What I'm going to do, as I've always done, is I'm going to finish at this particular point by just getting feedback from everybody, and then we'll close up and make the recording available for people to watch on YouTube tomorrow. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to some of the people in the audience and just ask what they thought of everything so far. Let's start with Shanaz this time. Hello again.
Hey. I'm left with a tool now to explore for myself. But I really found the competition bit interesting. Which was a surprise because I was getting ready for, I don't like competition. And I started to see that aspect for me was, that's an area, another word that I put there as well is like conflict. And looking at how to overcome conflict. Using that cycle. So yeah, thanks Jazz, it's been really, really useful.
I had that particular view of competition as a result of learning about nonviolent communication, because in my personal relationships, there have been situations in the past where I've ended up being quite competitive with my partner, and I've been looking out for my own interests and trying to deny them theirs. And when I started learning about nonviolent communication and looked at what it ultimately is about, which is about honouring people, nurturing them, and also ensuring that you're growing together in a happy way, then I thought, do I really want that person to be unhappy? Do I really want that person not to grow? Do I really want them not to be nurtured or honoured? And of course, for someone like me who's reasonably awakened, the answer to all those things is no, I don't. So it comes across as competition when you're not getting nurtured, honoured, or growing in the way that you feel that is in integrity. So in business, I don't see why it needs to be any different. People who work with one another, honour one another in their transactions, and contribute to each other in a way which they really feel nurtured, then in that sort of situation, there shouldn't be any competition. People all want to collaborate with each other, right? Yeah. So even between people who work in the same industry, what's the harm in two businesses that are working in the same space cooperating with each other?
Exactly.
So if you take on this mentality, especially nonviolent communication basis to this, then you do start to look at the world in a very different way, and you realise actually that it's okay to compete in this way that's been described here, because ultimately it leads to everybody getting on. So
it's like I'm here sensing from what you're saying, it's like a catalyst really. It just opens up possibilities of how we can connect even more and just clearing up stuff that gets in the way.
Yeah, and I personally am looking to live in a world like that. I think there's enough deception, enough lies, enough lack of integrity that's been demonstrated over the last few years with numerous organisations, whether they're political or financial, for example. And it's really important to understand the only way you're going to get transparency or authenticity is if people collaborate together to bring out the truth in a way which is compassionate, in a way which leads to evolution rather than destruction. It's got to be aimed in that kind of direction. If we all end up being more nurtured and more honoured as a consequence of the way the truth is brought out, then if we can do that through collaboration and nonviolent communication, for example, then we should at least begin with ourselves, and there'll be a natural radiance of that out towards others.
Yeah, I've loved it. I've loved that last bit that you said. Yoo-hoo! Bring it on. And I'm going to be cheeky now as well. I'm going to say, hello, Marinella.
I'm sure she's going to love hearing your greeting to her. All right, thanks very much, Naz. I'm going to just talk to you one or two others and we'll close up. Thanks a lot. Hazel.
Hi, I've just heard unmuted. I just wanted really to pick up on what Shanaz was saying, and it was just really interesting about the conflict, and that links in with the competition, because a lot of people see or perceive the word conflict as a bad thing, and actually I do quite a lot of work around conflict with people as well, and when they understand that conflict can just be needing to avoid a situation for a reason, or putting it on the shelf, or I need to collaborate, maybe I'll need to compromise at another time, for example. That kind of links also in, I'm now thinking with the model of the competition, because sometimes we have to go back and address those things and work out how we're operating, and to be able to move forward, like you say. And I've noticed, working with the model that I work with, which is Thomas Kilman, that people tend to we tend to fall into a habit of conflict. So it could be that we tend to overly compromise, or we always collaborate, which is good, but in a quick situation you can't always do that. So it's interesting to think about that in terms of this, and when we become more aware of those things, we can learn to observe how we operate and how we can move swifter through them. So
yeah, conflict is naturally as a consequence of people not being honoured, not being nurtured, not growing, or not being heard, not being able to express themselves, not being able to do a lot of things that are required as part of nonviolent communication, for example. So obviously, if you do the opposite of those things, you're not going to end up with conflict. You're going to end up with collaboration, and you're going to end up with communication between two people, which ultimately leads to compassion, and it leads to them actually becoming wiser and growing together, and actually stepping into a better experience of life in a mutual kind of fashion. So Marshall Rosenberg covers that in much more detail than I have today. He's actually actively worked in conflict resolution all over the world, and he helped me completely redefine my view of competition, especially. So it has immense significance, not just for you as an individual and in your personal relationships, but obviously when it comes to business negotiations as well.
Yeah, I've got his book. and I've sort of dabbled, but not properly. So you've inspired me. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Hazel. I'm going to just
Thanks,
with
Jan.
Christina and leave you to say the last comments.
Hi.
Go ahead, Christina.
Oh, hi. I don't think you can have last comments. It's a lot of comments, but just to thank you very much for the seminar. That was brilliant as always, and also to say that I am very interested in this cycle, this collaboration cycle, and I think it can be expanded into many other levels. And in particular, I'm very interested in the interdisciplinary dialogue, conflict and competition, and lack of a common language, and I'm working on this and thinking and researching on this, and so I think it could be applied also for this area that is kind of new area.
Yeah, I think interdisciplinary work is very, very critical when it comes to collaboration. I mean, people with very different training or education or knowledge or information at their disposal, if there's going to be innovation in the world, if there's going to be advancement in society or in humanity, then sometimes there needs to be collaboration, not necessarily between people, but between disciplines or domains of knowledge. And what you said there about collaboration and its purpose and function in interdisciplinary innovation and research and development and creativity, it's probably, one of the most critical areas where collaboration has to be something that people are literate in and are able to apply from a very early basis. So it's something that you and I both know is something that needs to urgently get people educated on. And if we can do it in that interdisciplinary way, then I'm sure the lessons that get learned from that can then be applied to the communities of the world in terms of cultures, in terms of nations, in terms of communities. and we will end up with not just a better world, but a much more advanced world, a much more creativity enriched world. And personally, I'm a big fan and really excited at the idea of doing something like that. So it's great to know that you're going to be looking to bring this into that kind of territory.
Yes, I'm thinking seriously into bringing this graph into the cycle into this field.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well,
and also I think there is another. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just think that there is also a layer that should be maybe introduced there, is the difference between power struggles, because sometimes this dialogue has between people or between institutions or countries or communities or whatever you are talking about, sometimes has a layer of power imbalance that distorts the whole thing. So even if it's necessary to have this awareness about where are you in this cycle and where the other people are in this cycle, because sometimes this unbalancing the power relationship can be really problematic.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've highlighted right at the beginning was,
for instance,
in terms of resonance.
Company, there are some people that have the power to decide on your, yes, and so this sometimes, if this cycle can be also a tool for awareness to deal with power imbalances or different power distribution among people, and can contribute to a higher level of collaboration and a better environment in work, I think it could be really great. What do you think?
Well, that's great. Thanks very much for that, Christina. I will make a comment on that, which is that I did mention earlier about the need to focus more on empowerment than power, and I also think along there I mentioned about liking and learning and priorities and preferences. But one of the biggest mistakes that people can make is to seek power and not be empowered in the process. I think if we focus more on being empowered rather than gathering power, then we are not just going to be able to make a difference to ourselves, but other people are going to look at us and look at how empowered we are rather than just how much power we have, and see something perhaps that they'll want for themselves. It's easy to want power because somebody else has got it, but I think if you see someone who's empowered, then that has much more of an attraction than someone who has power but isn't effectively using it for themselves in terms of their own growth or for the growth of others around them. So one of the things I'm personally trying to do on a daily basis to improve how empowered I am as a human being, and I'm hoping that in the process the lessons that I learn that I pass on to others will lead to them actually becoming more empowered. So this webinar that we did today and the webinar that we did yesterday on the whole subject of awakening and collaboration is really as a result of my own experiences on those two subjects, and I happen to be someone who can maybe articulate those things in a reasonably presentable way, so I thought I'd put them into the form of these two webinars and hopefully be able to convey something which will lead to other people being able to not just empower themselves, but then perhaps transfer those skills and techniques over to other people and empower others. And of course, if we carry on doing that, we empower ourselves and empower the people around us, and then they go on to empower the people around them, then the natural consequence of that is that the whole world will begin to wake up and enter into a much more collaborative mode of being that leads to people being more creative in finding solutions to the world's problems, but ultimately get to a point where we don't have to worry about problems. We can focus entirely on being creative and coming up with beautiful things to fill this world with, rather than have to be concerned about what's being destroyed. So if we can get to a place of beauty as a consequence of this awakening and this collaboration process, then I can probably die happy. So I think on that point, we're going to finish the webinar. I'd like to thank everybody who's taken part in the feedback and for attending. And I look forward to presenting another webinar in the very near future that you can all hopefully be empowered by. Thanks very much, and I'll say goodbye and good night.